sound. I don't know why. A friend of mine was born in Ireland, and he would say he was high-level CFO, so he was very educated, but he would say, instead of both, boat. The would be like that. I was like, man, I guess in some tongues, obviously there's lots of languages that we have no idea how to pronounce certain words. So, Ruth chapter 1. Last week, when we left our divine drama, Ruth and Naomi were on the road back to Bethlehem. Ruth is this woman that just gives an incredible act of loyalty and sacrifice to her mother-in-law. She chooses a destiny opposite of Orpah's. Orpah goes back home, and Naomi did quite a bit to try to get Ruth to do the same. Ruth, toward the end of our time last week, those very familiar words, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. So what Ruth is doing is renouncing not only her ethnic roots, but renouncing her religion. So as we closed, we kind of wondered what that walk back to Bethlehem might be like. And I wondered if there would be a lot of intense silence. Maybe because there was a little bit of tension between Naomi and Ruth. We know how this ends. Naomi doesn't, and this woman has just gone against her. And two, Naomi, I think, could very well have a preoccupation with her pain, her struggle, this uncertain future she's going back to, because she's going back home. But whatever the case is, I think we are going to be continually impacted by this young Moabite woman named Ruth. And we come, if you think of this as a divine drama, to an intermission or a pause between Act 1 and Act 2. But it's not your typical intermission. It is full of drama itself. It's just 4 verses we're going to cover tonight. We're going to begin with verse 19. It is a fascinating bridge between Act 1 and Act 2, full with a lot of things for us to think about. And as the curtain opens for the conclusion of Act 1, we find the 2 women arriving in Bethlehem. Now, in ancient cities, comings and goings like this are everyday stuff. No big deal. But there's something much bigger about this. Why would that be so? Why is this a big deal to more than just Naomi? What do you think makes this big? Remember, even going back to our story of the prodigal son, people were very connected to each other in community. So how long has Naomi been gone from her people? We really don't know technically how long. We know that we're looking maybe at 15 years or so. It's been a while. So you look at verse 19 at the beginning. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. If you aren't reading from the English Standard Version, what's another word that your translation uses there instead of stirred? Excited? Anything else? Moved. It's a great word. We're going to get to that in a minute. But the figure of speech that's being used by the writer here is called a synecdoche. You had that on one of your quizzes in high school, and just like me, you forgot it. It didn't govern the rest of your life, but it's a pattern of speech where the whole stands for the part. So when we see the whole town is stirred, it's not everybody in the town standing there waiting, seeing this woman coming. But there's a lot of people. And the wording of the Hebrew language here suggests that there was a joyous celebration. Verse 19 at the end, and the women said, "Is this Naomi? Is this Naomi?" Now, when they asked, "Is this Naomi?" they weren't asking Naomi the question, "Hey, Naomi, is that you?" They were asking each other the question. And this is a rhetorical question. What's a rhetorical question? One where you have an answer that's implied. If you said to your kids, "I'm a good mom or dad, aren't I?" It's kind of implied you should say yes here. So they recognize her. But going back to that word that a few of you had different translations of, that word stirred can mean one of two things. And how we're to exactly understand this, we would be able to know if we could have a book on tape, as they used to say, or something you could download, and the book of Ruth will be read by Ruth. They didn't have that technology then. They weren't even reading then. Everything was an oral culture, passed down the stories. So we can't hear the tone of voice of what the writer's using here. So the word, which is like a noisy hum for stirred, it can stand for anxiety and concern. And that might be because Naomi looks different than she did last time they saw her. What's different about Naomi since the last time they saw her? One is she's older. I wish we didn't age and change in our looks. Unfortunately, for me, we do. And also, what else has changed, do you think, in her appearance? Yeah, she just lost a husband and 2 sons. So that could be the feeling that we're supposed to get here. Or that word can mean astonished and joyful celebration. So either the women can't believe that this is the same person, Naomi, although she looked the same, could be the one that left them so long ago, or either they're just overjoyed to see someone they haven't seen in a while. Which one do you think it is? They can go either way. I used to always think it meant that they were all kind of a collective gasp. Oh, wow. You look different. But I kind of think maybe it was more of a happy spirit because this is someone they knew and loved, and she's back. But boy, her words in verse 20 at the beginning, she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara." I think Naomi's putting an instant kibosh on the town celebration right here, isn't she? Now, Naomi's coming into contact with people she knows. She's known all her life. And she, on the way back to Bethlehem, has been seeing places that maybe remind her of when they went out of Bethlehem to Moab. With who? Her husband? Her sons? And now she's back. She's back home. Now, what she's saying here is important because if you remember, the word Naomi means lovely or pleasant, and Mara means what? Bitter. She uses a name which is really the opposite, an antonym of her real name. So, as an example, my name is Michael. I almost said, "I've got a nickel." Remember that song? That's old. My name is Michael, and it originates from a Hebrew word. Mikael, if you know about the Hebrew, L's important, and it means who is like God. Or it can mean a gift from God. And the more you get to know me, you're like, well, of course. Yeah, he's a gift from God. I'm just kidding. So let's say that you haven't seen me in about 15 or 20 years. And I come strolling into the church and you say, "Hey, isn't that Michael?" And I reply, "Don't call me Michael. Call me Devel." Devel, that's an interesting word. How do you spell that? D-E-V-I-L. Like, oh, wow. Want to talk about it? Or maybe we should all leave the room now. That's a strong illustration, but you get my point. Naomi is telling the people of the town to call her now a name which is the direct opposite of the name she had when they left. Now, names are something in our day we give to our children. We like the sound of it. Maybe it's a name that's been passed down in the family. If you're like my wife and I, we tried every little thing to think, how can kids make fun of this name? Because number one, they'll try. That's kids. Even looking at their initials. Is there something here that's going to embarrass our kids with their initials? We try everything. But not so in Israel. Names weren't just labels of individuality. Names in the ancient Near East were descriptions of inner character, which in turn were meant to influence that person's future conduct. So if my parents were thinking Hebrew, we hope Michael's going to be like God. Hey, Michael, your name is like God, so how about acting more like God? But the contradiction between her name Lovely and her fate that she's been through smacks of mockery. She blurts it out. Lovely? Huh, you're right. Nothing could be further from the truth. Well, why can't we call you Naomi? Have you ever revealed something painful in the heat of the moment when someone was talking to you? What's been the kind of response you've gotten? You didn't mean to blurt it out, but it just came out. And people can sometimes look with shock. They're taken back because you're being, not that you're not a truthful person, but you're really bearing all. You're being honest here. And they could say, well, hey, things aren't really that bad. And the temptation, depending on how we're wired, can be to kind of bring it back in. Oh, hey, yeah, I just have had a bad day. Your brain is saying, enough said, shut your mouth now, don't go any further. It's no big deal. I've been just having one of those days. I'll tell you about it sometime when we have more time to talk. And then back to important things like the weather and other things like that. Not so with Naomi. She gives at least two reasons why she wants to be called Mara, why she is bitter. Look at the end of verse 22. First of all, Naomi says, for the Almighty, very important word, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Naomi on purpose uses the word Shaddai. You've heard of El Shaddai, a name of God. Now, the translation I'm using, the ESV, translates it as the Almighty, and that's a very good translation. Why does Naomi refer to God as Shaddai here? Well, it's not by accident. The name Shaddai appears mostly in Old Testament passages that involve blessing and cursing. It's used often in passages expressing judgment and power. All God's blessing and cursings, God's passing judgment on people, God's almighty power, Shaddai. So Naomi is using this name of God, I think, quite purposely in the context of her bitter complaint. I say that because there is an interesting parallel between Naomi's words here and a guy named Job. Turn with me in your Bibles, to the book of Job. Chapter 27. I have one of those speech-to-text things on Microsoft Word, and sometimes I'll turn it on, and it just reads through my notes, and on the way over here, turn with me to Job, she was saying. Job. Job 27, verse 2. Job says this, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, what's the word, do you think? Shaddai, who has made my soul what? Bitter. And I think another thing, Naomi's feeling that Yahweh is making her a target for his arrows. And it parallels another passage in Job. Look at Job chapter 6. Job chapter 6 and verse 4. Job says, for the arrows of the, what? Almighty, of Shaddai, are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Go back to Ruth. Isn't it interesting to see the opening up of Naomi's heart here? This isn't the first time she used the word bitter. Remember back in verse 13, she begged Ruth and Orpah to go back home because her life was what? It's too bitter for you. Go back. So we see really a lament of Naomi that's developing in a way. It's becoming more focused. When she says this, her bitterness, it's linked to God somewhat indirectly. But look at verse 20. She then gets real specific. Shaddai, the Almighty, has dealt very bitterly with me. In the original language, in the Hebrew, it's obvious she is directly charging God with her situation. She is saying, the Almighty has made my life indeed bitter. And you can see the people in the town going, there's going to be a lightning strike here, so let's just back off. Naomi, you stay right there. This is blasphemy. Look at verse 21 at the beginning. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. She's just quickly magnifying her bitterness here. She thinks about when she left. I went away full. Now, she was leaving Bethlehem. Why? Her husband and her sons and her were leaving Bethlehem. Why? Famine. So it's not like, yay, there's a famine in the land. We're going to go on a road trip. We get to go to Moab. No, but she's still saying, hey, this is stuff that I deal with in life. I am having to go to a foreign country, but it didn't drain the drops of her full life. It was just part of life, and she was not blaming God. Question, how would you do if things in America got so bad that you were forced to move to another country to survive? Not county, not state, but country. In 21st century life, I think we consider, and rightly so, it's kind of traumatic moving from one state to another for a job transfer. It's especially that way because it kind of upsets the normal patterns of our life, but it gets way different when it involves what? Kids. My wife and I have moved quite a bit from country to country, really from state to state. Here's our move since I've pastored. We moved from South Carolina in 1989, I won't give you all the years, to Illinois. And then we moved from Illinois to Michigan. And then we moved from Michigan to Florida in the dead of winter. Man, that's a great move, in case you're wondering. From Florida to Maryland. Now, Michigan to Florida was a little bit traumatic. We didn't expect it to be, but Justin was only, 3. And we kept telling Justin, this is where Mickey lives, Mickey Mouse. So we were telling him this, and we were going to Jacksonville, just outside of Jacksonville where I was going to pastor. So that's right across the line. We crossed the line, and Justin, we said, hey, we're in Florida. And he's like, Mickey's house. And we're driving, and he thinks we're going to Disney World. And we tell him we're going to our home first. We're not going to Disney World. And he just starts crying. Like, what probably wasn't good. In his mind, he thought we're going to Disney World. But when we lived in Florida, Justin grew up there and had friends. And this is 4 years later. And so I took Justin aside. I remember we were at my parents' house. I had just candidated in the church in Maryland the weekend before. They had voted that Wednesday, voted me in. So once I knew, told my parents, my family, so I told Lisa, I'll take Justin out and just have a drive and break it to him gently. And so I remember pulling out of the development where I grew up and just telling Justin, I don't know how I said it, we're moving from Florida to Maryland. And his first words were, you're kidding me, right? Now, how old is he here? He's 94, 7, 6 or 7. Said, no, Daddy got a church in Maryland. We'll live outside of Washington, D.C. It's where Mickey lives. No. So he didn't cry, but he was not happy. His sisters were too young to care. Now, when we moved from Maryland to Virginia 11 years later, Justin just graduates high school. He decides to stay back because he was in a band and he had friends there. And we thought it would last maybe 6 to 9 months, and it lasted almost 9 years. He didn't move to where we were in Virginia for a while to help my dad transition after the loss of my mom. We then came in 2013 here, and we gently give little nudges. Justin, you can come with us if you want to. And you can come visit us, and please. He was stuck in Maryland. He said, why don't you come visit me here? It's like, well, this is where we live now. We'll come visit you. And it took a while. The pandemic hit. He was a nurse in Maryland, and that's where we just felt his loneliness. He's very social, and he just is like, we visited him Thanksgiving, and just Lisa and myself, and we could tell that he was beginning to crack a little. And he just started asking us more questions. We told him, our house is your house. Please come if you want to. He finally decided to do that. But our plans, our moves always involved going to a church. That's where we're going to be living because that's where the church is. But in all those moves, Lisa and I didn't have to move. We chose to. And we never had to move because there was a lack of food where we were. So put this in perspective. Naomi is forced to leave her homeland because there's no food in the house of bread, Bethlehem. And she isn't moving to just any country, she's moving to Moab. Do you remember how Moab started? It started because of an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters when they got dad drunk. So it's not a great beginning as a nation. And they were friendly with Israel, Moab was, but the Israelites thought they were too friendly because they knew Moab wanted to intermarry with their women. So in all this, Naomi still seems content. She goes with the flow. She makes this life for herself and family in Moab. And then she experienced losses she did not anticipate. Losses that seemingly reached her to the limit of her suffering. And she says, I went away full from you, and I'm coming back empty. I have nothing. I have no husband. I have no sons. Naomi may have left her homeland physically empty because of the famine, but she was emotionally full. Now, by God's providence, Israel is full with food, but she comes back to the place full with food, empty. And a question that probably was on Naomi's mind is, why does the God who cares so much for the plight of widows allow there to be more of them? She goes on to say in the second half of verse 21, look there, why call me Naomi? When the Lord has, and she gets legal here, testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. Don't call me pleasant, don't call me lovely. And she then borrows a term from Israelite law and says that God has testified against her. She sees herself as a defendant in a legal action, and she has been found guilty, and she has been sentenced, and she is punished. But she doesn't know what the charges against her are. And the testimony against her is kind of rough because who's on the testimony list against me? The creator of the universe. That's not good. She is up the proverbial creek with no paddle at all. There's no more credible testimony in the universe than God. How would you like to be removed suddenly from your home and be declared on top of it guilty of a crime, sentenced to life in prison, and start serving your prison sentence the same day? I was hearing, I think that it was Singapore. They were talking about in Singapore, if you visit there, a friend of mine would visit periodically because the seminary where we graduated from had an extension in Southeast Asia. And he would go there and teach sometimes. And he said, man, you could eat off the streets. It is just impeccable. It's gorgeous. Lots of money. He said, I would get off the plane and my handler would just give me all this spending money. I'm like, I'm good. I'm fine. No, have it. But Singapore has some pretty tight laws. And I believe one of them, if I was listening correctly, was that if you're found dealing drugs, there's no 1, 2, 3 strike. You're found guilty dealing drugs, you are tried, you are sentenced, and you are hanged pretty much within the same day or two. That is a de-incentive to be a drug dealer. So she's feeling right now, I just had a really, really bad experience with the legal system of the universe, and basically my arms are too short to box with God. She's so low. I mean, that phrase, Shaddai, the Almighty, has brought calamity upon me. I think one of the reasons, at least I think a lot of us are drawn to this story, is the display of humanity in the writer. Like Jeremiah and Job and the psalmist, Naomi stands open and she's raw and she's honest right before God in her suffering. If Ruth models for us what devotion looks like, Naomi models complete honesty. And she's not the only person in the Bible to do this. Job did it. The Psalms are full of it. 3/4 of the Psalms are called lament Psalms. People that love God, but they feel beaten up, and because they believe God is sovereign, who else do they go to with this? Look at verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now, what's interesting is the structure of the first part of verse 22. In the original language, it's the narrator of the story gives Ruth's return prominence. It's further highlighted by the way he refers to her as what? What does it say? Ruth the what? Moabite. He uses her full name, and he's purposely underlining the fact that she is not from around here. She's a foreigner. And as we read this story, I want us to be deeply aware of the fact that it's real easy in the middle of all of Naomi's outward grieving. It's real easy to forget that she's not alone. Look at her words. I come back empty. I was full. I have nothing. Ruth's like, hey guys, how are you? I'm nothing, by the way. Hi, I'm with you. I told you I'd be with you, live and die. I'll be buried with you. Think about what Naomi has just said. I'm bitter. And I have nothing. One writer said this, Naomi's journey has been a journey down to the depths, and that is all she can see. She can see only what is right in front of her face, and that is her pain, her situation, her loss. But isn't there someone with her? In her anguished response to the overjoyed cries of the women of Bethlehem, all absorbed in her own world of pain and bitter affliction, she fails to even acknowledge the fact that Ruth is right by her side. She fails to acknowledge to these women that this is not only her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who is new to town, but who has turned from her people. She's turned from her religion. She's pledged that she will willingly go husbandless and childless to her grave so that she can be by Naomi's side. Naomi has tunnel vision, and perhaps that's best illustrated in the fact that she is only speaking in the singular. Bitter indeed, the Lord has made my life. I'm empty because Yahweh brought me back. The Almighty has pronounced disaster upon me. So far, Naomi acts as if she's the only one grieving. She doesn't even acknowledge that not only is this Ruth, but why is Ruth her daughter-in-law? Where's the son? He died. Yes, she's a widow too. And in a subtle touch from the narrator of the story, Naomi utters her complaint as though Ruth, whose words of loving commitment still ring in our ears, has never said anything about being committed to Naomi at all. When we're hurting, it can be easy to think that our pain, even though we know it's not the worst there is, it feels like it's the worst there is. And in doing so, we can fail to see the pain of someone right in front of us. Now, I have a job where every day I'm reminded it could be worse. With all different ages, if I'm ever having what I call a tough day, I just think, at least I'm on this side of the visit. And there was one couple just one of those couples, he had ALS, and we just clicked as friends. He was younger. And he was just open and honest. It was just an amazing journey to walk with him and his wife. He, right up front, told me, I'm not a Christian. And he said, I don't want to be a foxhole Christian. And I said, I get that, but let me tell you about the greatest foxhole Christian in the history of foxhole Christians. He was a thief by the cross. He's only minutes from dying, and he says to Jesus, hey, today, can you take me where you're going? And Jesus says, yep, that's last minute. So you're not going to be that last minute. And he had a series of, he's a smart guy, a series of arguments against things, but I could tell his heart, because of the ALS, was real tender. And again, like I told you, I can't say this is the way, the truth, the life, or I lose my job, but I can share my faith. And I said, here's what I believe, and here's why I believe it. And over time, he accepted Christ. He became a Christian. It's so great. And caught fire for God. On his phone, couldn't watch enough great preaching, just soaking it in. Hey, is there a study Bible? Yep, here's the ESV study Bible, and here's another good study Bible. And he just was on fire for God. And there would be times when we would talk, and we had like a routine. I would come into their house, and the first thing the wife would do is let me in, and then she would leave the room. And she always came back with not only a can of Pepsi, but it had been poured into a cup with ice in it, because she knew I like Pepsi. I'll take Coke too. And she set it by me. And it was just like I was just hanging out with friends. And there would be times, and it's real important. It's not hard for me to think, don't share your junk with people. As a pastor, if you went to a counselor and you were talking about your life, and all of a sudden the counselor said, yeah, me too. Can I tell you about what's been going on with my wife and I? You'd be like, I'm paying for it. It's my time. And as a pastor, I've gotten used over the years to maybe a little bit overboard. It's not about me, it's about you, in kind of a priestly approach. And it's hard for me to talk about things in my life. But I would talk about a few things. And I remember every once in a while, I'd just say, I'll say his name's Tim. It wasn't Tim. I'd say something. I go, so Tim, you think you have it tough? Did you hear my problem? And it was like a personal joke. Yeah, I got ALS. It's going to be a little bit worse. And so the problem is, even though I have that kind of job, I still catch myself thinking, maybe I'm not dying right now, but who knows, I could be, And gripe, God, I believe in God's sovereignty, so God, why are you allowing this, God? And I'm going back and forth, and I'm stuck so many times in things. And there's that great song by Tim McGraw, Live Like You Were Dying. I love that song, based on the reconciliation with his father, Tug McGraw, the great reliever for the Phillies, had cancer. I don't know if Tug McGraw said those words. I went skydiving, I went Rocky Mountain climbing in 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu, and I loved sweeter and forgave sweeter, and I loved deeper, and I gave forgiveness I have been denying. Son, I hope you get the chance to live like you're dying. But I do find in being with those who are dying, they have a clarity about life. They have a clarity about what matters. And I'm amazed how many of them don't have I have it the worst, because you could say, yeah, you have it the worst. A number of years ago, maybe you heard about this, there was a lot of buzz about this speech on YouTube called The Last Lecture. And if you were to go to YouTube tonight and just type in The Last Lecture, it would pull up this speech given by a man named Randy Pausch. Randy was dying of pancreatic cancer. And as you know, that's one of the most aggressive forms of cancer there is. And he was asked by the school where he taught computer science, Carnegie Mellon, not an easy school to get into. They asked, would you give a last lecture? And he decided to do this. He wrote in the book by the same name, quote, I knew what I was doing that day. Under the ruse of giving an academic lecture, I was trying to put myself in a bottle that would one day wash up on the beach for my children. I mean, it's a moving story. He writes, quote, from the time I'd gotten sick, I saw it as my mission to do all I could to lessen the burdens in my wife's life brought on by my illness. And I continued to read in that book about Randy's story. And I was struck by the fact that he did not want to focus on his sickness. He begins that lecture, the last lecture, by saying this, quote, in case there's anybody who wandered in and doesn't know the backstory, my dad always taught me that when there's an elephant in the room, introduce it. And then he clicked a button and said there was on the screen a picture of his CT scans. He goes, these are my CT scans. There are approximately 10 tumors in my liver, and he circled them on his presentation, and the doctors told me I have 3 to 6 months of good health left. That was a month ago, so do the math, he says. And he flashed this giant image, and where the CT scans were, the title of it was called The Elephant in the Room. And then he said this, all right, that's what it is. We can't change it. We just have to decide how we'll respond. We cannot change the cards we have been dealt, just how we play the hand. And then he said, if I don't seem as depressed or as morose as I should be, sorry to disappoint you, I assure you that I am not in denial. It's not like I'm not aware of what's going on. And he talked about the temptation to feel sorry for himself after a very painful surgery, one of the surgeries he had. He mentioned how sad he is about having to leave his wife, and at that point, he just had 3 small children. But then he looked down the hall at a man in his hospital that was dying of cancer that had 5 children. And he was reminded that there's always someone that has it worse. And if you read that book or listen to that speech, I'm just constantly touched with how he dealt with his grief. He was so much more focused, making every arrangement he could for his wife and his 3 children to ease their lives after he was gone. And I was amazed that instead of just crashing and crying, he spent every day making every memory he could with his wife and his 3 children. And I don't want to use a story like that as you shouldn't weep or grieve over the pain in your life. Someone's got it worse, suck it up, buttercup, as you hear some people say. I'd like to think that I'd be that centered, that other-centered if it was me. Probably not. That's why I'm not pointing the finger at Naomi right now, at her thoughtlessness toward her daughter-in-law. But if I were pointing my finger, there'd be 3 going back at me. Look at verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Is that about odd to you? Is there a trip that Ruth made to Jerusalem that we didn't know about? Why is the narrator saying Naomi and Ruth returned from the country of Moab? To the best of my knowledge, I don't think that Ruth had been to Bethlehem. You know, Lisa and I have gone on a number of trips, pastors, like conventions. I was able to take her to 2 of them. And I was really interested in going to Seattle because I love coffee. And by the way, every cup of coffee in Seattle is like, I've never tasted anything like this in the world. And unlike what people would say that it rains all the time in Seattle, the week we were there, it didn't. You could see Mount Rainier beautifully to the last day. Now, I know since then Seattle's had its problems. But you would think it's strange right before I take off for the first time to Seattle to say, yeah, we're returning to Seattle. Oh, you've been there before? No, but we're returning there. I think one reason the author is phrasing it this way is Naomi's return meant a return for Ruth as well. Ruth finally has a true homeland. The people and place that she dramatically embraced in verses 16 and 17. She has her life headed in the right direction. And I think the phrase ushers Ruth back into the middle of the drama. That's why the book is named after her. Now, notice the way the author concludes Act 1. Look at the end of verse 22. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. According to the calendar those folks used back then, called the Gazer calendar, the barley harvest began in late April or early May, which was the 8th month of the agricultural year. This is, to use fancy terminology, an agrarian society built on farming. So at that time, Israel brought the first fruits as a dedication of the harvest. They were told to do that in Leviticus 23. The wheat harvest followed about 2 weeks after that. So why do you think the narrator is mentioning the beginning of the barley harvest at this point in the story? Well, maybe it's supposed to sound to the original hearers like a faintly joyous note. All the somber things that Naomi has been saying. The time of harvest for people like this was a time of rejoicing, especially because they experienced famine. It was reaping, they sang, it was a time of celebration. So the remark there about it being the harvest could very much be a relief of the tension that's built up here. But the harvest also signaled an end to the famine. We can almost sense the author kind of in a delighted, slightly smiling way, thinking, what a coincidence. They arrived just in time for the barley harvest. Who'd have thunk it? So, summation of Act 1. 2 problems in need of a solution are introduced here. The provision of food for the widows and someone to carry on the family line. And we've seen that the virtue of Ruth's human loyalty is exalted as worthy of a reward by God. And though most of chapter 1 is darkly clouded by uncertainty and hopelessness, the end of the chapter begins something new and hopeful. So when God is at work, bitter hopelessness can be the beginning of surprising good. And one more thing, and you know this, but God uses pain and suffering to draw us closer to himself and to each other. If you talk to someone about, tell me a time you really grew in your relationship with God, there's a reason that oftentimes that story about their growth involves some sort of suffering or hard time they went through. And they end by saying that God is so good. Even though it doesn't end with a hallmark ending, it still is great. I still trust him. I put this on my Facebook page today, so if any of y'all looked at this, it may sound familiar. Author J.R. Miller, not the same J.R. from Dallas, because he was a bad man, wrote the following. I dated myself by saying that, didn't I? Sorrow causes deep scars and indelibly writes its story on the suffering heart. We never completely recover from our greatest griefs and are never exactly the same after having passed through them. Yet, sorrow that is endured in the right spirit impacts our growth favorably and brings us a greater sense of compassion for others. Indeed, those who have no scars of sorrow or suffering upon them are poor, he writes. God has ordained our truest and richest comfort to be found by pressing on toward the goal. Sitting down and brooding over our sorrows just deepens the darkness surrounding us, allowing it to creep into our heart. And soon our strength is changed into weakness. But if we will turn from the gloom and remain faithful to the calling of God, the light will shine again and we will grow stronger. And many of you have found that to be true in your life. When we are going through deep pain and sorrow, Satan takes advantage of those times. God is inviting us to follow him. God is inviting us to walk by faith, because sight right now is really bad, so believe in me. A lot of the lament psalms, the writer of the psalm will say, here's how bad things are, but yet, and those are huge words, but yet, and things turn to, I trust in you. I trust in your unfailing love. There's no solution to the problem given in the psalm, but they are turning with the eyes of faith and believing God that he's going to do what's best. Satan doesn't want you to think that at all. He wants you to ball up your fist in anger against God, and there's no but yet in your sentence. God, you've allowed this and this and this to happen. Why? Now tell me I'm supposed to believe in you. What's so great about the Christian life? Well, I've said it before, but if the Christian life meant that when you became a Christian there was no more suffering, pain, or sorrow, who in the world wouldn't be a Christian? Everyone would want to sign up. Jesus said when he was on earth, you follow me, you're going to experience much suffering and sorrow. But don't be dismayed, I've overcome the world. A number of you know the story of Corrie ten Boom. She and her family, they were housing Jewish people during World War II, were caught. She and her sister were sent to a prison camp. Some of the things she says about sorrow and darkness, she has one of those lives that you pay attention because you know she's been through it. And she said this one time, when a train goes through a tunnel and it gets dark, you don't throw away the ticket and jump off. You still sit and trust the engineer. Wow, that's powerful. So, think right now, and you don't need to say anything out loud, but think about a time in your life that if we were sharing right now, that would be the story you would tell of how hard it was, how dark it was, how scared you were. And it doesn't mean your story has to be, but everything turned out wonderful and God is good. But in all that suffering, you grew to trust God more. And let me put it in the present tense. You're learning to trust him more. Let's close in prayer.